First of all, I just want to make it clear that not all Muslims define offence in the same way. Not all Muslims take offence at the same things in the same way. Muslims are not homogenous, and I don't claim to speak on behalf of Muslims, but I think likewise, nor should anybody else. So when somebody comes on this show and says, well, Muslims find that offensive, I think what they really mean is, I find that offensive because I'm very insecure in my own belief about God. The second point I'd like to make is that there is no right, yes, there is a right to be offended. There certainly is no right to tell others or insist that others do not offend you. They are two very different things. Everyone is free to take offence at anything. I mean, people could take offence at my dress sense. But what they cannot do is insist that I dress in a way that doesn't offend them. They are two very different things, and that's important when discussing cartoons. The second thing to distinguish is that every idea is open to scrutiny. No idea, whether it's a philosophy or a religion, is immune, or can be, or should be immune from scrutiny. That's different from hate speech. But we've already established the point that Muslims are not a race, and we've also already established the point, as Kate made so well, that there's a big difference between scrutinizing a religion and its founder and picking on individual Muslims. No one here wants to pick on people. What we're talking about is the importance of scrutinizing ideas. Why is that so important? The reason it's so important is it happened to me last year, it happens to millions of Muslims across the world. Minorities within minority communities. There are feminist Muslims, there are gay Muslims, there are ex-Muslims, there are liberal Muslims, there are dissenting voices, upon whom the charge of blasphemy is used, not just to silence them, but to actually kill them. People use this excuse of Islamophobia, and it is an excuse. It's not Islamophobic to scrutinize a religion, just as it's not Christianophobic to scrutinize Christianity. But they want to silence minority voices.
Maajid Nawaz.
Well, to quote Sarah Palin, I repudiate the whole fuss. I mean, I really don't understand what the big deal is, because I think time and time again we play into the hands of the clash of civilizations rhetoric and the Al-Qaeda choice between Islam and the West. And there is absolutely no choice. It's a false paradigm. Muslims are born and raised in the West and have served in the British Army for a very long time, and the same with America. Now, with the mosque example, I mean, first of all, it's not in ground zero, but even if it was close to ground zero, it's not a sign of American weakness at all. It's not a sign of Islam conquering America whatsoever. In fact, it's a sign of American strength, and it's a sign not of Islam conquering America, but of freedom of religion reigning supreme. And I think that's what America should be proud of, and the fact that they can accommodate a mosque in that vicinity, as they accommodate all other sorts of places of worship, is something they should be very happy with, and they should spread that message around the world to say they are not at war with Islam. But if they make this an issue of America versus Islam, and if they hold the Muslims of New York responsible for the actions of a few terrorists, then what they end up doing is reinforcing Osama bin Laden's rhetoric that they are at war against Islam, and pushing more and more people in this polarized worldview that it's us versus them, and it's not us versus them. So I think that it's really been blown out of proportion and really doesn't deserve all of this fuss.
Douglas Money.
So something extra had to have happened to this 1400-year-old religion, and that's what I call the ideological narrative. Where did that narrative come from? Well, it was actually what happened is that it was used as a form of resistance in the colonial times, because these, in the Arab world, they adopted post-World War I European fascism, ideas of a super state, a super people. They adopted these ideas. They first became Arab socialism, known as Baathism, which led to the Saddam Husseins and the Gaddafis, and then on top of that, they built it onto the religion, and it became Islamism. And so it's this peculiar combination of modern fascism superimposed onto religious doctrines, which is different to the Islam of my parents and my grandparents. This is the work we do. So when I was in prison in Egypt, as a political prisoner there, interesting, in the same prison that eventually held Hosni Mubarak, it's called Mazar al-Torah prison, one of the things I did is have a conversation with a convicted professional bomb maker. And he came to Egypt to train Egyptians to cross the border into the Gaza Strip, to train Palestinians to kill Israelis. I said to him the following, I said, look, the majority of these people protesting, first of all, the largest protest against the Iraq war wasn't in Pakistan, it wasn't in Saudi Arabia, it wasn't in Turkey, it was in Britain, this country you want to blow up. Second fact, most of the protesters were non-Muslims. So what does that tell you about the people you define as your enemy? In fact, Turkey is a member of NATO that's part of this alliance, so surely you should be trying to blow up Turkish Muslims instead of the Brits who were opposed to the Iraq war. Now, first of all, I kind of got a look from him that kind of told me he wanted to kill me. But that conversation lasted over a couple of weeks. And one day I was in my cell, and he came knocking on the door. And he said, Maajid, you know, I've been thinking. Now, this is a guy who knows how to make bombs and kill people. He says, you know, I've been thinking, these people aren't my enemy. He said he was still a terrorist, he was still an Islamist, he was still an extremist, but he no longer believed in targeting Britain. I mean, it's a step forward. Ish, yeah, I suppose so, yeah. So,
jihad. Boy, we need about 1,000 of you out there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you, audience. Thank you, panel.
It's very important for us to understand that there are two extremes in this debate. There are those who are trying to be polite, and usually the left and the liberal commentariat, who insist that these attacks have nothing to do with Islam. And then there are those who, usually anti-Muslim bigots, who say they have everything to do with Islam. And then, of course, those in the middle who want to be careful succumb to what I call the Voldemort effect, which is, you know, he who must not be named, and we cannot name the true problem. I think the answer here is that these attacks have something to do with Islam. They also have something to do with foreign policy. They have something to do with identity and grievances and underemployment. But what we cannot deny is that they also have something to do with the religion of Islam, my religion itself. And I call that something the ideology of Islamism, which seeks justification and inspiration from an interpretation of my religion. And the importance in recognizing that is that because Muslims, imams, common everyday Muslims, along with everyone else in civil society, as we did with racism in this country, as we did with homophobia, we all have a role to isolate, identify and challenge this Islamist ideology. And that's a generational struggle that lies ahead of us. Can I ask you, who would you look for? When you're saying we're looking for Muslims, would you look for Adam Gaddan, the American white Al-Qaeda spokesperson in America? Would you look for Muriel Demacoq, who's a Belgian white woman who was the first suicide bomber? Hold on, the first suicide bomber in Iraq was a Belgian white woman. Yeah. The Black Widows in Chechnya who invaded a theater in Moscow, who were wearing jeans and t-shirts. Yeah. Who would you look for? What does a Muslim look like? Clearly is, let's not look for people that look of Middle Eastern origin. Let's not look for people of a specific ethnic, geographic background. The US has already done that. They've listed 15 countries, and importantly, they haven't listed Britain, where most of the transatlantic attacks have come from, or even the Hamburg cell, Germany. They haven't listed any European countries. It just doesn't make sense.
Saudi Arabia, where most of the 9/11 bombs came from.
So the fact is they use Germany and Britain as a source. Richard Reed is a convert. There's a disproportionate amount of converts that are joining these organizations to attack.
Just because a certain group of young people commit those crimes, everyone who wears that brand isn't a criminal. So obviously, the riots in 2011, the media stereotyped that it was 18 to 24-year-olds, but on the streets it was more 30-plus-year-olds who were looting and stealing.
That's a very, very good point. I think there are two different issues here. First is that of youth being targeted on the basis of the way that people dress. Well, no, if you wear a hoodie, it doesn't mean you're necessarily a criminal, but you are statistically more likely to be a criminal, and therefore you're going to be judged by the police in that way. That's very unfortunate, but hey, the police have got to make snap decisions like that.
Sorry, where
That's very, very separate and very different from the issue of racial profiling, which is utterly apparent and there's no excuse for. And none of this should justify stopping and searching, which is simply unconstitutional. You should not be able to stop someone on the basis of how they look. Nevertheless, I don't think we can blame the police for trying to bring law and order to the streets by making judgments that are irrational on the basis of people hanging around in groups or gangs, or people looking a certain way on the basis of their clothing. And you know, that's not unreasonable.
Maajid, you want to jump in there?
I'm just curious, because if you think that the majority of people that wear hoodies happen to be preparing to commit a crime...
No, I didn't say that.
Or they're statistically demonstrable to have been carrying something, and most people in California are wearing hoodies these days. I just find that really strange, where the statistics are that demonstrate these days people wear all sorts of clothing. I mean, that strikes me as preposterous as saying most people wearing pink ties and grey suits are bankers who are basically ripping everyone off. I mean, that would
probably
be a stereotype.
They probably are.
There is a triple threat facing European civilization today. A triple threat. The first is from the far left, the extreme left wing. The second is from the far right. And the third is from the Islamist extremists. We're familiar with the far left and we're familiar with the far right. I'll give you a one-sentence definition of what I mean by Islamist extremism. And that is the desire to take any interpretation, any form of Islam as a religion and impose it upon society. That's what I mean by Islamism. And the use of force to do that is what I refer to as jihadism. Now, these three ideological trends
agree on one thing. Essentially, they agree on their hatred of the Jewish community. The far left across Europe, the far right, and the Islamist extreme agree to pick on the Jewish people.
Sent some photos of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and Jesus and so on. I think you've stirred, you know, all you've got to do is do a slight thing and stir things up in the community. Do you know what I mean? We're Muslim people living in this country, born up and everything, and it just takes a little bit of, you know, just there's something small to ignite things. And I think you as a politician coming from, like you claim, an extremist group, need to be much more careful about, you know, what you say and what you do.
I think this was about the cartoon.
On my Twitter account, somebody tweeted an image of the Prophet Muhammad. I, as a Muslim, retweeted the image and said, A, I'm not offended by anyone who's not bound by those rules to tweet the image of my Prophet. And I said, God is greater than to take offense at such basic. It was a cartoon of Jesus saying hello to Mo, and Mo saying, how are you doing? I mean, it was really, really bland. And it just caused a furore. And the reason it did is because it's prohibited within traditional interpretations of Sunni Islam to draw the Prophet. And my point was, look, coming back to all this theme on communities, and this is where I'd like to address you, sir, because I'm coming from where you're coming from. I've served time in prison. I actually opposed the Iraq War from a jail cell in Egypt. You know, and I've witnessed torture. I know where you're coming from. I've seen all the grievances of your worst nightmares. So it's not that I don't empathize with the concerns of the Muslim communities. The issue is that we have got to take a level of responsibility within our own communities to address these issues. If racism was widespread, when I grew up in Essex among the white working classes, responsibility was taken to a point where we have now a black president of America. The debate was shifted in civil society. It's now taboo to be racist. Likewise with homophobia, likewise with anti-Semitism, because that's how civil society debates can shift when people get involved in activism. So my purpose in retweeting the image was to say, look, we have got to open up our faith to scrutiny. We've got to open up our views and our beliefs to scrutiny as everyone else is scrutinized, and we've got to be mature enough not to feel offended when somebody says, I don't agree with this particular view of your religion, but we've got to have an open debate about it, and that's what it means to be in a liberal society.
I would like to ask Asif is, at the end of the day, you choose to identify yourself as, you identify yourself as gay. Why do you then choose, because it is a choice, why do you then choose to be a Muslim when it says explicitly within Islam, within Judeo-Christian tradition, that that is prohibited? Will it be okay and accepted to be gay in Islam? That is not, it's a loaded question, but I'm sorry, you either be gay or you be Muslim. No one is forcing you to be a Muslim. No one is forcing you to be a Muslim.
Yeah, lady here in the blue.
I think that is totally wrong. I mean, I was brought up in an Islamic household. I'm from an Islamic community. I'm from a very conservative Pakistani community. If my mum and dad can accept me, why can't the wider community accept me as well?
This lady in the blue, and then we'll come.
I mean, I will speak out and continue to speak out, and you're right to identify however you want, because what we're hearing right now is, and you guys can also think whatever you want, the danger with literalism is in insisting that there is only one interpretation and one way of doing things. If we take that literally, if we take literalism literally, then only 200 years ago, slavery was accepted and justified by religion. Let me finish. The Quran explicitly and literally, let me finish and make this point. The Quran literally allows for slavery, as does the Bible, but we no longer practice it because our attitudes and interpretations have changed. There is no one Muslim community, there is no one way of interpreting things. If he wants to identify as being Muslim, as this gentleman here said, Abdullah, he said he's not going to tell him he's not a Muslim, and I applauded him for that. He said he's not going to discriminate against him. You just did. And so even he disagrees with you. Yes, you did. Everyone knows.
Has the terrorist ideology of groups like Al-Qaeda become so mainstream that they no longer have to seek refuge in places like Afghanistan?
Well, I think so. Sadly, what's happened since the death of bin Laden is I believe President Obama had his own mission accomplished moment when he declared effectively that Al-Qaeda had been defeated. What in fact has happened is that they've become stronger than they ever were under bin Laden, whereas under bin Laden they were asylum seekers in Afghanistan. What they are now is the ones giving others asylum. In countries like Syria, in the opposition, they've come to hijack that revolution. They're controlling cities. They had controlled an area larger than the size of France in Mali until the French expelled them. It's an insurgency. It's not just an organization. And the phrase I often hear that I despise, this phrase, Al-Qaeda inspired terrorism. No, Al-Qaeda didn't inspire terrorism. It's the end product of decades of this ideology festering on the grassroots in the Middle East. The end product is Al-Qaeda, but terrorist organizations existed before Al-Qaeda. We had Hezbollah, we had Hamas. In Pakistan, there's many, many organizations killing people on the streets, including the Taliban.
And how much support do they get from local population?
They ask the similar sorts of questions that I heard you asking here on this panel. They sit in Iraq and they ask, why did 500,000 children die before the Iraq War? And when Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was asked by Leslie Stahl on 60 Minutes, she said, is the price for American foreign policy worth the death of 500,000 children? And Albright said, and I'm quoting her, she said, that's a tough question, but I think the price is worth it. And it's when they hear those sorts of responses that they ask the similar questions on the other side. So there's an ignorance on both sides that needs to be addressed, and part of my work is attempting to address that on both sides.
Okay, well...
Keep working on it.
The danger of not naming this ideology is twofold. Firstly, within the Muslim context. Those liberal Muslims, reforming Muslims, gay Muslims, feminist Muslims, dissenting voices, minority sects, the Ismailis, the Shia, all these different minorities within the minority of the Muslim community are immediately betrayed. How are they betrayed? Because you deprive them of the lexicon, the language to employ against those who are attempting to silence their progressive efforts within their own communities by not naming the ideology. You surrender the debate to the extremists, and actually what happens as a result is they hijack the debate, they monopolize the discourse, and communities divided even further apart, rather than bringing people together, even though the intention of the President Obama was to try and bring people together. The second danger is in the non-Muslim context. What happens if you don't name the Islamist ideology and distinguish it from Islam? President Obama in his speech said there's an ideology we must challenge, and he didn't name it. So, think about it. You're sending out the message to the vast majority of Americans, there's an ideology you must challenge, but then you don't tell them what's it called. What are they going to assume? The average American is going to think, yeah, I've got to challenge an ideology. It's called Islam. You're only going to increase anti-Muslim hatred, like he who must not be named. You'll increase the hysteria, the Voldemort effect I call it, by not naming the ideology, because the average guy out there will then assume the president is talking about the religion itself. But if you distinguish Islamist extremism and say, look, Islam's a religion, we're not going to tell you what good and bad Islam is. We're not going to define that for you. What we can say is you mustn't try and impose that on anyone else. If you do, that's called Islamism, the ideology. And that's what we have a problem with. Unless you make that distinction and isolate the people that you're challenging, the average non-Muslim out there in the world who doesn't know that will think, yes, we've got to challenge the religion, all Muslims are bad, let's drive them out of Europe. So actually, it doesn't do us any favors not to name this ideology. And with that, I'll end because I have someone far better than me who's waiting to speak.
I hope from you all here today, and that is that there are many Muslim voices. On a positive note, there are many, many Muslim voices emerging from across the world, in the Middle East, in Europe, in the United States of America, who are beginning to wake up to the threat that is Islamist extremism. There are those Muslim voices, but they are nascent. They are worried about speaking out against what could be perceived as their own religion. They face peer pressure. They face all forms of stigmatization and discrimination from within their own communities. So whereas we will continue to lead that charge to speak against Islamist extremism, I will ask you to find those Muslim voices wherever you see them, give them a chance, hear from them, cultivate those voices, because those partnerships mean everything if we are to march forward together against the scourge of anti-Semitism and against that triple threat. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Unapologetic about this. I take a very traditional view on marriage, and I know that it is probably very unpopular nowadays, and I'll be accused of being a dinosaur and being behind history and all the rest of it. But I believe marriage is fundamentally about children. That's about creating children who in turn create society and create family and create society and create stability in that way. And that's my interpretation that I have of it. Now, I know I would be vilified now for having that view. No doubt I'll be accused of being homophobic. No doubt I'll be accused of being close to being racist. And everything else that is nasty and bad in the world, because it is a traditional Christian view. And the reason why Christians are vilified about this point of view is because we're to be scared off from expressing that point of view. But I will express it proudly and honestly because it's how I feel. It's also how, quite frankly, the majority of my constituents feel.
Look, if when I was 15 years old, growing up in Essex, as I've mentioned before, look, if somebody came to me and said that the President of America is going to be black, that the most prolific rapper is going to be white, Eminem, and the Conservative Prime Minister is going to legalise gay marriage, I would have laughed you out the room. Now, what does that tell us? What that tells us, Mr. Ian Paisley Jr., is that you're yesterday's news, basically. And what you just said in your spiel almost sounded like, I'm not racist, my best friend is black, but... Right? Now, you've got the right to your opinion, but it's the equivalent of me, as I used to say, sitting here promoting bigotry, homophobia, anti-Semitism, wanting to kill women because they've had sex before marriage, and saying these are all my opinions and I want to lobby law to bring them about. The fact is that they are bigoted opinions. You said you didn't want to say it. I will. They are bigoted opinions. They need to be challenged. Frankly, you have the right to those opinions. What you don't have is the right to stop somebody else expressing themselves in their own way, so long as they're not harming you, so long as they're not entering your bedroom and forcing you to sleep with a man. Don't force them to sleep with a woman.
All right.